Welcome back to Sudbury Politics, the show. This is the second in our series, The Fourth Estate, a look at the media. The media is a big chunk of politics, and we've got an amazing guest today that's seen both sides of it. Mike Whitehouse. Thanks, Mike, for joining us.
Great to be here.
Yeah. And as always, we got Rachel and Richard with us.
Hello, Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Mike, maybe start off by telling us a bit about your history in the media.
Well, I graduated from Laurentian University with a BA. I then went to Cambrian College to take a one-year journalism program. This was back in the mid-1990s, I think. My first journalism job was on Manitoulin Island at the Manitoulin Expositor in Little Current. Owned by Rick McCutcheon, whose family still owns it, I believe. It's a quaint little family business and an institution on the island. I was there for about 6 months, the summer and into the fall. It's a different kind of journalism than anyone else knows. You know, I did everything. I wrote stories. I'd write 1,000 stories a week, thousands of photos. You know, you lay the paper out, you deliver the paper, you sell ads, you collect money from people. You do it all, and you do it all over 70 hours. Over the course of a week. It was a lot of fun, actually. I really liked Manitoulin Island, but it's a tough way to make a living, I'll tell you that. After 6 months, I think in the fall, geez, I don't even want to speculate what year it was, but I do remember it was November, and Carol Mulligan, who was the managing editor at Northern Life at the time, and Northern Life was a lot different from the Northern Life we know today, or the Laurentian Publishing we know today. She offered me a job, and I could not get in my car fast enough to drive back to Sudbury. And the newsroom that she had there, the newsroom that I joined, was probably the best newsroom I've ever been in. Darren McDonald was there, Patricia Mills was there, Wendy Bird was there. Wendy is now at CBC. Colin Fries, who's now with the Globe and Mail, was there for a little while. Our staff photographer was David Weewell, who ended up leaving after a few years to go into freelance and now owns a coffee store in town. The legendary Keith Lacey was there, Jim Brown, Kim Dominic Plouffe, who else? Vicky Gahula was there, and she was the associate editor, and I believe is still there. I hope is still there. She's survived the cuts. So that was a huge newsroom, and it was and Michael Atkins at that time was investing very heavily in the newspaper. That was back when it was 3 times a week, every Tuesday, Friday, and Sunday, and they were big papers. I mean, they were 70, 80-page papers at that time, full of classifieds, chock full of ads, full of special sections, full of promotions, full of flyers. It was a booming business at that time. But over the 2 or 3 years, it started to fall apart. Colin Fries left to Ottawa or Montreal or something on his way eventually to Toronto. Pat Mills and Wendy Bird went to Northern Ontario Business, which had started a couple years earlier. Wendy actually moved to Thunder Bay to open a bureau there for Northern Ontario Business. And then Dave left. Not long after that, Darren McDonald left to go to the Sudbury Star. Then Carol Mulligan herself left to go to the Sudbury Star, and then I left to go to the Sudbury Star a few months after that. And that was right around the year 2000. That happened. And I was at the Sudbury Star from about 2000, 2001, in there somewhere, right up until June of 2012, when I left to begin an exciting career in politics, which is where I am now. So,
yeah,
I'll say because you had Dave Kilgore on I think the first episode of your Fourth Estate series. That was about a month ago, and I watched that episode. And so Dave and I, of course, worked there together for a few years, and we're still friends. And I want to reiterate some of the things that Dave said, because it certainly came across to me. It became clear to me. I hope it was clear to you, and I hope it was clear to your viewers. What a difficult time that was, you know, to be at the Sudbury Star from 2000 from 2010 until today, you know, a period of cuts. Because when you go to work as a journalist, and I tell people this often, that it's not really a career path as much as it is a vocation. It's a form of community service. It's to me, it was the best job ever. It really was. You know, you go in, you go out, you talk to people. You listen to their stories, you see what they're doing, hear about what they're talking about. You get to write it up in your own words, take pictures. The next day you go and do it all over again. It's you meet new people every day, and always usually for good reasons. And the fact that they pay you to do it is a bonus. I mean, it's like the old saying, when you do a job that you love, you never work a day in your life. And that's what journalism is, and that's what life at Northern Life and the Sudbury Star were in that era. And Dave was a real newspaper man, and I think he explained that really well. And so when he was given the opportunity to come to the Sudbury Star and serve as publisher, he saw that as it was a real feather in his cap. The Sudbury Star was at that time probably the most successful media property in Northern Ontario. It was the largest and oldest newspaper. The paper turned 100 years old while he and I were both there. And it had a reputation. It was the newspaper of record, not just for Sudbury, but for Northern Ontario. And it was, if you love journalism, if it's what you wanted to do for a career, then there's no better place to do it than at the Sudbury Star. That's how I viewed it. Most of us who worked there viewed it that way. And David certainly did when he came to Sudbury from North Bay to take on that role. So over time, and David explained the cuts and how it worked and what the company, the successive companies, Sun Media and Post Media, wanted from him and wanted from the paper. But over time, it became really painful for Dave, I think, to come to the realization that his job was not to rebuild the paper or to extend its legacy or reinvigorate it, but rather his job was to slowly destroy it, to preside over its dismantling. And that was really difficult for Dave. It was difficult for all of us. It was a really shitty hand that a good newspaper man like Dave was dealt. We were all dealt a shitty hand, and we played that hand as long as we could, until we ran out of cards, and then eventually had to tap out. And so most of us just started to leave around that era, around 2010, 2013. That's when I left. That's when he left. Rob O'Flanagan left. Denny St. Pierre left. Lara Bradley left. Kenny Gordon left. And the paper continues on. There are great people still working there, but there are a lot fewer of them, and they do a lot less.
So thanks for that, Mike. It's great to hear kind of your background and, a comparison of what the newspaper industry was like then and kind of more what it looks like now. So kind of a follow-up to that, I guess my question would be, there's, of course, as you mentioned, a lot fewer journalists now. So what do you see as the implications for there being these less resources to go out and conduct this investigative journalism?
Well, the implication, as Dave Kilgore said, is that with fewer resources, you don't have time to. Well, there's two or three different things. For one thing, you have to appreciate going in that some stories can't be told in a day. Some stories, not you just go out, make a couple phone calls, talk to a couple of people, take some photos, boom, story. I mean, in an ideal world, a lot of them are like that. But some stories, especially your complicated stories involving municipal politics, for example, or any level of politics, require several days of research, several days of work, several days of interviews, maybe even require you to go to another place, another city, or travel somewhere to talk to other people on background. And, journalism like that requires a real investment from your publication. They have to give you the time, to be able to do that, and in some cases other resources as well. And a newspaper like the Sudbury Star, for example, and Sudbury.com towards the end, of course, they had none of those resources. If the story didn't fall into their lap, if it couldn't be handled in a couple of hours, so you could go out and do 2 or 3 other stories in that day, then it just wasn't going to happen. It sat on the back burner, and it might sit there for 2 or 3 weeks until you think maybe one day I will have time to do this. And then eventually it just disappears off your radar because you never have time and never will. A lot of stories get lost that way. Unless you have time to tackle them when they're hot, when they're fresh, when people are invigorated by it or engaged with it, then chances are it'll never get done. So that's number one. I think that's the question you're asking. But number two is what it leaves newspapers with is the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit. I work in a political office, for example. I shoot off a press release and it will get run. right? And chances are maybe that's it. Maybe I'll get 1 or 2 phone calls about it that my member of parliament can talk about or speak to. In an ideal world, that's what happened. That's what I want. You know, when I send out a press release, my intention is that it serves as an invitation for media to call us and delve into it further. That's what I hope happens, but that doesn't always happen. In fact, increasingly it happens more and more rarely. And that's the consequence, is that the kind of stories you cover change, and then the stories that you do cover become easier and easier. And a lot gets missed. You know, you'll find a lot of communities that have lost newspapers altogether. Smaller communities in Northern Ontario, like Kapuskasing, for example, which no longer has a newspaper. Who covers their council? You know, who holds their council and school boards accountable? Nobody. Literally, nobody does. That's a big loss.
Part of that, and it goes back to this idea of having the time to do the stories, is there used to be a deadline, right? There used to be, you had to get all your content together for Tuesday's paper or Monday's paper. That's gone now. It's who can get it out first by the minute, not first by the day. And that's really led to a lot of these kind of news sources that come out and are competing with the paper. Do you see a way to ever balance that out and still have this kind of thoroughly thought out news versus these fly-by-nights?
So one of the other consequences of a decline in investment in journalism is the slow resurgence of what they call citizen journalism. So, you know, instead of having a trained journalist go out and cover something, you encourage someone in the community to just send it to you. You know, send me a blurb about what you're doing and maybe a photo, and we'll run it that way and we'll call that a story. Or maybe you'll plump it up into a bigger story. I remember as early as 10 years ago, you know, when Sun Media bought the Sudbury Star, that's what they wanted. That's literally what they wanted. We're not going to go out and cover cats and trees anymore. We're going to encourage people to send us their stories of cats and trees and photos. And that was an abject failure on a lot of levels, because what you're getting is inconsistent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. But in all cases, you know, it's not reliable. It's never reliable. Yeah, I mean, how do you know it's true? How do you know anything is true when the person who sends you this information is not themselves a trained journalist or experienced journalist? You know, that method is rife for manipulation in a lot of ways, not just partisan manipulation, although that's what ended up happening. Yeah. But the fact is, it's just not reliable. And I'm not saying that journalists are you know, trained professionals and only journalists can do journalism. You know, one of the best journalists I ever worked with, Rob O'Flanagan, never went to journalism school. He was just an arts major, but he was a tremendous storyteller. And at the end of the day, that's what journalism is. It's telling stories. So the idea wasn't bad, but the motivation was all wrong. They adopted the citizen journalism model not because it was a good idea, but because they wanted to cut costs, and they figured they could offload the work to regular people rather than getting their own staff to do it. And
I gotta say,
that's why it failed.
That was a fantastic tool running a campaign. When we were running Brian Bigger's campaign, I would write things that looked like news articles, post them to Sun Media's platform, share them through social, and it would come with the Sudbury Star headline.
Exactly, the UR Sudbury web portal. That's exactly what it was. Yeah,
it was beautiful. Yeah,
and it was right for me, and people did. How long did it take you to figure that out, right? But those of us in the business, we saw it coming a mile away. But there's nothing we could do. That's exactly what they wanted. So, but to get to the second half of that point is that you're talking about quasi-journalistic institutions, or filling the void with news. We all know a number of news organizations. I'm doing the air quotes on camera. That have filled this void. So as legitimate media, traditional media, legacy media withdraws from the media landscape, as it must, because there are fewer resources. There's a void, there's an information void, especially given the advancements in social media. So there's so many more people online, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, looking for information, looking for news. And as the legacy media withdraws, who's going to fill that vacuum? And it could have been anybody. At first it was you running a mayoral campaign, but
Yeah.
today, it could be anybody. It could be Canada Proud, it could be the Post Millennium, it could be Spencer Fernando, it could be Rebel News Media, and that's the danger, is that the void exists, but a void doesn't exist for long. Someone fills it. Someone always fills it, and when it's unregulated, when it's unprofessional, it's untrustworthy. It's untrustworthy by nature.
Jeff was mentioning that, and Rachel too, that we count on media as playing such a big part in the political sphere. Politics and good policy making and governing, which because you're involved in that now too, Mike, is and we're in the mayor's office as well, is complicated, and the stories are complicated, and the decisions are nuanced, and we count on public support and public reaction to the moves that government makes as a barometer of how successful those policy moves are in a lot of cases, because we're not swinging back around enough as another consequence, and looking at the actual impact of policy decisions. So really, it's like, is this a popular thing? That
Mhm.
means it's a good thing. Can you talk about a little bit of the challenge in getting accurate information in the hands of a population? The role that media isn't able to play in that anymore?
Well, so as I was just saying in answer to Jeff's question about that void, when there is a void, and there's constantly a void as legacy media withdraws and as more and more social media channels emerge, um, you 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 end up with so many other organizations, trying to fill that void, and then you end up. It can cause a lot of confusion in media consumers about what's legitimate and what isn't. And after a while, even legitimate news sources begin to look illegitimate because they are so starved of resources. Maybe they're not giving you what you want. Maybe they're not giving you the complete picture that you need. And that's true on a number of levels. For example, when 10, 15 years ago, when I was covering city council for the Sudbury Star, it wasn't unusual for there to be 8, 9, 10 journalists sitting at the media table. There'd be someone from television. There'd be 2 or 3 private radio reporters there. There'd be always someone from CBC, often someone from Radio Canada there as well. My guess is if you go to a city council meeting this week, you'll find no more than 2, maybe 3 journalists at most, and maybe 1 or 2 will pick it up from home later on, or watch it live streamed or something like that. So the fact that you have, when you had a lot of journalists competing for stories, you got the consumer at home would have got a more complete picture of what took place that night, because every journalist would go away with a different idea, would go away with a different idea of what the main story from that night was, and maybe even a different interpretation of that story. So if you consume media, and you would have seen the same story presented to you, or the same ideas presented to you from 3 or 4 different journalists on 3 or 4 different platforms, you would get a more complete picture of what that story was about. Whereas now you'll just get one, and it may not even be a complete story. Maybe it's just a really short story because the person who was at the city council meeting was actually at the end of their workday, and they'd spent all day doing something else, and that was the low priority for them. So you don't have media paying attention to things the way they should. You don't have independent or individual journalists giving the kind of attention to important stories the way they should. And believe me, they know that. They are acutely aware of what their own limitations are, and it bothers them more than anybody, more than it does the consumer, that they have to do what they know are possibly half-assed jobs and uncovering news stories. But again, it comes back to that first question, which is the less complete job you do, the less journalism there is, the less journalists there are doing these things, the bigger the vacuum. And it's that vacuum that's the most worrisome thing.
Yeah, I remember when I was in the middle of that whole KED debate, we had a lot of conversations back and forth with the media. I was always kind of surprised with the lack of follow-up on things that I would present. I actually had a former, I won't mention the politician, but a former Sudbury politician that said, God, I wish I was a politician today, because you can just say whatever the hell you want and there's no time to fact check you.
And believe me, that's not a competence issue. I mean, they know there's
Yeah.
it's simply a time issue. They just don't have time. When I was at the Sudbury Star, you were required. It was not written in stone or anything like it was. We were contractually obligated to do this in our collective bargaining agreement. But as a rule, as a journalist, as a reporter, you do one story and two briefs. Two briefs being like a 1 or 2 paragraph thing that would appear down the side of the local page, page 3. And that was a day's work. One good story and 2 briefs. And a good story would have 3, 4, 5 sources in it. You look at the average story today, it was probably thrown together in an hour, a couple hours, and it'll have 1 at most 2 sources. And the journalist who wrote it probably wrote 3 or 4 other stories as well. And that's just not a sustainable model. It burns out your journalists. You're not giving the stories the respect that they deserve, and at the end of the day, the consumer notices it. It's inevitable.
Yeah, well, it's not uncommon now to see a story about a council meeting 10, 20 minutes after the council meeting's done. So obviously they're writing at the council meeting.
Yeah, well, and sometimes journalists are live tweeting it, or doing social media while they're there, and then they're expected to go away and write a story, and as soon as that's done, after 5 minutes, then you got to go to another event and do the same thing all over again there. Like that kind of pressure. You don't get to invest time or energy or thought nearly as much as you would like to, nearly as much as we did. I remember routinely having 2-3 weeks to work on a project, and nothing was expected of me in between. And as a conscientious journalist, I would have come in and done some things otherwise, and worked on this thing in the background, and then deliver a large project, a multi-source story, with 8 or 10 sources, after a couple of weeks of work on it. And that's just not possible anymore. I don't even think that you could do that at a large newspaper like the Toronto Star or Globe and Mail.
No.
That'd be a real rarity in Canada, but it was commonplace in Sudbury just 10 years ago.
Yeah, but without that kind of investment from the newspapers, without them being able to make that kind of investment, I look back at like the Elton John scandal in Sudbury, right? I don't think that could ever be covered again. So what's the effect on politicians when they know that can't be covered?
I wouldn't say it wouldn't be covered. I mean, at some point that information would become public in some form to some degree, and someone might write something about it, but whatever it was would be incomplete. You'd get half of a picture, and someone would publish half of a picture. Maybe someone else would pick it up and do another half of a picture, and as a consumer, it would be up to you to either read between the lines or to pick these various pieces up and try to put a puzzle together. Whereas in that case, as you pointed out, Denny St. Pierre had the time and the resources to do it right, and he did, and he pursued that doggedly for about a month, and he required traveling out of the city to do it, and interviewing tons of people and reviewing tons of documents and lots of FOIs. It was quite a process, and it's the inability to invest that kind of time or effort into something that you'll never see a story as complete as that. But I still think you'll see stories like that, because I mean that was a real lightning rod for public discontent. But it won't be as complete. There'll be a lot of things that you'll never know about a story like that. Because Dennis told you everything. He laid it all out. He explained everything in great detail. It's the stories you'll get, the level of detail that Dennis was able to produce, you probably won't get.
Mike, I love your point about the freedom of information requests. Of course, being a world that I lived in for quite a while, but as you know, they could take up to 30 days, just for standard ones to get back to media were they to submit that request. And if there's third parties and other sources, you could be looking at easy a few months. So definitely not as possible if you're trying to pump out a story very quickly. I do have a question about newspaper chains or, certain newspapers. I'm wondering whether, of course, we hear sometimes that certain newspapers and their executives have a tendency to lean a certain political way. They have a certain political ideology in mind that they're trying to push through their staff, and have those staff, those journalists, write their pieces leaning, perhaps the left or right way or whatever way it is. Have you seen that? Do you have any thoughts on that piece?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. First of all, to be clear, journalists are people. They're human beings. They're some of the smartest and most informed people I know. So journalists have political leanings. They do. It's just a fact. You know, I was a working journalist. I have political leanings. I defy anyone who ever read anything I wrote to tell me what my leaning was at that time. As for partisan media, absolutely. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll tell you a story about what it was like when I was at the Star. One of the many jobs I did this for about a year and a half, was the opinion page editor. So my job was to write the daily editorial, unsigned editorial that represented the view of the newspaper. I also handled columnists and letters to the editor, stuff like that back when there were letters to the editor. So the process of developing the daily editorial, unsigned editorial, was long and onerous, a lot harder than it needed to be. It was essentially three people. It was myself, the managing editor, and the publisher at the time. The managing editor and the publisher at the time were both hardcore conservatives. I mean, like reform, Preston Manning conservatives. And one of the issues I remember strongly was whether or not Canada should have gone to war. I think John Chrétien was Prime Minister at the time, should have gone to war in Iraq with the United States right after 9/11. And they believed wholeheartedly that we should, that we were terrible friends, terrible allies, that it was unbelievable. Like Jean Chrétien needed to be removed from office immediately because he refused to follow the United States into war. I believe the exact opposite. And that happened all the time. We would meet for about 45 minutes every morning to discuss the next day's editorial and discuss potential editorials. And it was a nightmare for me, just a nightmare, dealing with these guys, because they're table thumping and, all the liberals, all the progressives have to go. It's a nightmare, and this country is going to shit and everything's going to shit. Those are torturous times for me. And in the end, I had to write an editorial that Canada should have joined the war effort in Iraq, even though personally I abhorred that view. Now, the good news is that as the editorial page editor, I had the opportunity to evolve other views and put them in the newspaper. So, for example, if I came across an opinion piece from the Kingston Whig Standard from a political science prof at Queen's University, with a long argument about why Canada should not go into war in Iraq, then I was free to publish that opinion if I wanted to, because it was my page, right? And I would, a day or two after I wrote that editorial, I would publish a newspaper column from a professor that completely debunked the editorial that I wrote the day before. So, that kind of freedom was always there. And in all of that, there was never, ever a hint of interference corporately. So, whether we were owned by Conrad Black at Hollinger, or later by Osprey Media and Michael Sifton, after that, the Toronto Sun, it was very rare that someone from corporate would call and say, hey, that editorial was wrong. You have to change that. You can't run that. You have to retract it. You have to run this other one that we're giving you instead. I have no recollection of that ever happening, and I'm not sure it happens today. It may look like it happens today. What I think is happening today, the degree to which there's partisanship in the opinions that a newspaper outlet will espouse, like the Sudbury Star, for example, which is now run by Sun Media and Post Media, is that the newspaper is simply starved of the resources it needs to produce its own editorial content. So right now, when I was at the Star, we had 6 or 7, 8 editors, something like that. Today there's one. There's literally one guy who's responsible for the whole paper, the front page, all the local news, the lifestyle, the sports, everything. And that guy just doesn't have time to develop columns, to write editorials, even 1 or 2 a week. So starved of that opportunity, starved of that resource, they have no choice but depend on the corporate entity that they work for. And so, if you don't have time to write a column on the importance of universal basic income, for example, and maybe the editor at the Star believes in a universal basic income, without that, the opportunity or the time to do that, then eventually some media will come to you and say, oh, look, we've got an opinion on universal basic income written by Brian Lilly. Why don't you use it? And that's what ends up going in the paper, and people interpret that as the paper's position on universal basic income. But does that represent the views of the people who work at the Sudbury Star? Absolutely not. I can assure you it doesn't. Does that represent the views of Sudbury? Absolutely not. No more so than those two asshole editors I used to work for back in the day represented Sudbury. They were completely out of step with the community. But those were the vagaries of the business. Today, the vagary of the business is that there's just no resources for anything. You know, if you're putting together the Sudbury Star today, you are grateful that someone is giving you content, even if that content is shit. And from the Toronto Sun, it is shit.
Yeah. Do you see any way we could get back to some kind of credibility within in journalism, within how stories are written?
Only with resources. That's all it is. It's simply a matter of time, of effort. And you know, it's funny you say that, because you know, even as recently as a couple of months ago, I thought we had a model like that at Laurentian Publishing. I thought Northern Life was that. You know, the problem with the Sudbury Star and daily papers like it is that they're monolithic. You know, they do one thing. They only do one thing, and they used to do it really well, and then demand for it disappeared. You know, the classified revenue fell off, the ROP advertising disappeared, circulation disappeared. They tried to make money online, and that was always hard to do. The business model was a failure, and it was an obvious failure, you know, 15, 20 years ago, and now it's collapsing. What Northern Life has been able to do all of this time was diversify a little bit. You know, they had a newspaper. They cut it back from 3 issues to 2 issues to 1 issue. Now they have no issues. But they did invest heavily and well and wisely, I think, in their website quite a long time ago. And they've always done a pretty good job of keeping it fresh, of keeping it current, and churning it well over the course of a day. But they had a lot of other business enterprises. You know, they had Northern Ontario Business, which is a nice, tidy little paper. They had specialty publications, the Mining Journal and the Health Journal. They had a lifestyle publication. They had the events that they do, the 40 Under 40 and the Community Builders Awards and the Northern Ontario Business Awards, which moves around the north. And all of them came with specialty publications and sponsorship opportunities. So that business, Laurentian Publishing, was able to diversify itself. And honest to God, I thought if any media property was going to survive this evolving, changing landscape, that would be it, because they were always able to cross-populate and germinate the various enterprises that they all ran out of that single building. But of course, it didn't work. You know, we learned a month ago that everything collapsed, and that successful website has now been folded into another one, and that's that. So if Northern Life couldn't make it, if Laurentian Publishing couldn't make it, honestly, I don't know who can. So it appears to me that CTV in Sudbury is investing in news again, and that's good news. But you know, TV went through a reckoning a long time ago. You know, it used to be every city in Northern Ontario had its own evening news broadcast, and all of that was consolidated into Sudbury. And you know, now you might have a couple of independent journalists working out of their cars in you know, Timmins or North Bay or Sault Ste. Marie. Maybe they're in a position to invest now because those things they've reconciled those costs. I hope that's the case, because you know, I'm always in favor of investing in media.
Mike, one last question for you. We know you're very passionate about journalism. You always have been. If you were a journalist today, as opposed to the current position you're in, is there one political story that you'd really like to cover or highlight, especially for Sudbury, perhaps?
I still have a lot of journalistic instincts, and right now my instincts are telling me not to answer that question.
Fair enough.
Honestly, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that's not getting done. But you know, maybe if there was more investment in journalism, and you know, you'd see the fringe of a story appear, then it would appear that, you know, like a tiny fire of a story, maybe it would the embers of one, you might suspect that would become a burning fire one day. But I don't see anything like that on the horizon, to be honest.
Well, until then, we'll have the citizen journalists running things out there, including a local councillor. And we'll have to go from there. Thanks a lot, Mike, for joining us. You're our first guest to reach friend of the show status and get a tote bag. We really appreciate having you on the show, and I'm sure we'll have you back again.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yep.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mike.
Mike.
Thanks, everybody.
Don't have too much fun with your swag. I'll enjoy my Paul swag. Thanks, everyone.